After testing out the new iPad mini for over a couple of weeks, one thing has become really apparent to me. This little iPad is actually really suited for gaming. The size combined with the new power of the Apple A15 chip make it a little match made in heaven. So I've been trying out a bunch of games for it recently, and I wanted to share with you what I've found. Now for this test, I'm actually going to skip over the more simplistic games that I usually start with, because if the iPad Air from last year handled all those okay with a previous processor, I think it's pretty safe to assume the new A15 chip in this iPad mini will. So without further ado, let's jump right into some of those bigger, more taxing games. And if you do like iPad and aesthetic-y tech content, I've got lots of that here on the channel, so be sure to subscribe. Anyway, let's get right into it. Okay, so starting with the classic that is Genshin Impact, you'll be really happy to know that this pretty much runs flawlessly. I cranked the graphics settings to the maximum and set the frame rate to 60, really letting the game run at full steam, and I'm really happy to say it held up really well. I actually touched on this game in my initial review of the iPad mini, so I do have some prior experience with playing this on here, but it works really wonderfully. Even in more full-on fights with particle effects, switching characters on the fly and activating special abilities, it ran at a solid and steady 60 frames per second with little to no hesitation. Considering it's such a good looking game, this was fantastic to see. Although it is worth mentioning that Genshin Impact does react heavily to thermals, so depending on how long you play the game for, you can expect different results as things do go on. Moving over to League of Legends Wild Rift, I actually had a lot of people ask me to include this game in my previous video, so you'd excuse me if it appears I don't really know what I'm doing. I've not played a MOBA before. However, what I can tell you is the iPad mini runs this like a champ. Wild Rift actually has an FPS counter at the top right of the screen, and this stays at a consistent 60 FPS. On the surface, this doesn't look like an overly taxing game, but when fights get into full swing, there's a lot going on, and the iPad mini and the A15 chip seems to hold up really well. If you like this game, you'll love how nicely it does run on the iPad mini. I also wanted to quickly touch on PuBG Mobile and Call of Duty Mobile because I know they're super popular games on the App Store, and if you had any concern of these running badly on the new iPad mini, you can totally forget it. I maxed out both of these games on graphics and frame rate settings, and they ran basically perfectly. No holdups, stutters, or any sense that things were getting too much for the iPad. I think a lot of this is kind of expected though. These games aren't new by any means, and they've been running well on iPhones and iPads for a good few years now, so this wasn't overly surprising to see, but it's still good regardless. Moving on from there to the Pathless, this was another game I tested briefly in my initial thoughts on the iPad mini, and again it's another game that the mini runs extremely well. After some research though, I believe this game is actually locked to 30 frames per second, which is a shame. It's certainly staying really consistent there, so I think the iPad could probably push it a bit harder. As I mentioned though in that previous look, there's no noticeable drop frames, and despite it still being stuck at that 30 FPS, it still feels really smooth. I really do hope the publisher updates this to run at 60 frames per second because I really do think the iPad can do it. The final game I did want to test is one of the most demanding of them all, and that's Divinity Original Sin 2. This was advertised as a next-gen experience for the iPad, and there's actually quite a high requirement to play it. This only works on iPad, not iPhone, and only on Pro models from 2018 onwards. The 2020 iPad Air also works, and this new iPad mini, and nothing else before them works. But, whoa, I can really see why. This game is graphically stunning, shadows, textures, lighting effects, and environments all look fantastic, and they all run really well on the iPad mini. This is certainly a slower game than some of the others I've tested, so it was difficult to tell what the frame rate is running, but I'm pretty sure it's running at a solid 30 FPS, which does stay consistent throughout, which is good to see. Furthermore, there's really no compromise on this game. This is the full PC version shrunk down onto an iPad, and you can play it with touch, a controller, or even a full mouse and keyboard setup, which is just crazy for an iPad. I actually ended up plugging it into my monitor and hooking up a mouse and keyboard for a more true experience, and despite it being really strange, and I don't think you should pick an iPad over a PC to play this sort of thing, it was pretty good. Something else I did notice while playing these games on the iPad mini is there's actually a small border around the screen while playing each title, which actually took me a little bit longer than I'm willing to admit to notice, and obviously it doesn't affect the gameplay and there's no cropping of any picture, but it's still very much there. For me, no gaming test is complete without running it through my TV, and while I don't expect loads of people to do this, I think it's a worthwhile thing to look at, so let's cover it. Obviously bear in mind, I can't really do this test with games that require touch control, so PuBG and Wild Rift are out of the running for this specific test. So first up, I loaded Genshin Impact, and it really surprised me with how well it ran again, because when I tested this on an M1 iPad Pro in a previous video, I saw some really clear frame rate drops, but it was really hard to spot any on the iPad mini. Everything was running just as good as it was on the iPad alone. So much so that I actually ended up grabbing my M1 iPad Pro again, and perhaps Genshin has had an update since, but it also ran a lot better than in my last test, so that was really good to see. The Pathless also ran just as it had done before on the iPad alone, keeping that perfect 30 frames per second, and so did CoD Mobile, which was really good to see. The biggest test for the iPad mini and the new A15 chip though was in Divinity Original Sin 2, which took a very clear tumble in frame rate while linking it up to a TV. I actually had noticed this while playing it with a keyboard and mouse at my desk, but it became ever more clear while running this on the big screen. The graphical fidelity stayed really excellent, but the frame rate was all over the place depending on what you were doing and where you were going. Despite that, I wouldn't have called it unplayable, just not overly comfortable. Interestingly, the frame rate on the actual iPad stayed at a solid 30 frames per second, while it was only the outputted video signal to the TV that was getting its frame rate chopped up, which was really interesting to note, and it just reminds me of how frustrating it is that the iPad doesn't support external displays better. I'm not sure where the blame lies for this, as some apps can fill an entire external display like LumaFusion, but I really wish games would do it, and if I could turn off the iPad screen and power the external monitor directly, the iPad would become an even better device to game on. After all this testing, which lasted about 2 hours of on and off play, the iPad mini had heated up quite a lot, not to an uncomfortable amount by any means, and I would be fine to continue gaming on it, but compared to the M1 iPad Pro, which I tested last time, this had a significant amount more heat kicking out from it. That could be due to the size of it, of course, as this is much smaller than that iPad, but it's also worth keeping note of. Overall, it's really safe to say that the new iPad mini is a little beast when it comes to gaming, but I still don't think you should buy one solely for that. At a £479 starting price, that's more expensive than a PS5 and an Xbox Series X, which will give you a far superior experience. However, most people tend to compare this to the Nintendo Switch, and while that's more fair as it's a portable system, for me the iPad mini doesn't really come close. It's way more expensive than a Switch. I mean, you could grab a Switch, an extra controller, and some games for this sort of money. And let's face it, while the App Store has some hits and the iPad is a significantly more powerful tablet than a Switch, it's the games that matter, and the Switch has a much better library of games that outrank pretty much anything you can get on iPadOS. So I do believe the iPad mini is an amazing gaming machine, I just don't think you should buy it for that alone. The fact that it can game along with all of its other features and functions is just a wonderful extra to have with this iPad. Playing games on here is a genuinely great experience, and you should enjoy everything it has to offer, but don't pick it over a dedicated console unless you've done your research and can be happy with what it can deliver. And that pretty much rounds up this video. Do let me know in the comments below if you think there's any other games I should try out. I always love finding new ones or just hearing about the ones that you're playing. And pop a like on the way out too, that would be massive, and I will see you all in the next one.